The thing about working intake at Vethrani Station 12 is that nothing happens fast. You process manifest forms. You cross-reference species entry certificates. You drink whatever passes for coffee on a Vethrani orbital hub, and you wait for the next freighter to dock. And then you do it all again. I had been doing it for 6 years. I was very good at the waiting. Pip had been doing it with me for 4 of those years, in a travel carrier under the intake desk. She was a ferret, a Jill, 5 years old, pale cream with a brown mask, about as long as my forearm, and not much heavier than a half-filled water bottle. The carrier was regulation approved. I'd cleared the paperwork twice, once when I transferred in, once when the station commander changed and his aide went looking for something to flag. Both times the form came back stamped. Pip was a registered companion animal under the Joint Species Welfare Clause, and that was that. She slept most of the day. When she wasn't sleeping, she investigated whatever I put in the carrier with her. A knotted rope, a ball bearing, the corner of my data tablet case. She had no opinion about the Vethrani personnel who walked past, or the Thalassi traders who stacked their manifests 6 inches thick, or the scaled Karathi ambassador who had once stopped to look at the carrier with an expression I could only describe as deeply unsettled. Pip had looked back at him from inside the mesh, yawned, and gone back to sleep. The ambassador had not returned to the intake bay since. I mention all of this because the events of the 14th of the 9th standard month are now on record in 17 separate station logs, and most of those logs describe what happened in terms I find technically accurate, but tonally misleading. They say voluntary Apex compliance event. They say uninstructed de-escalation. The Apex Behavior Registry entry opens with the phrase, stimulus animal, class indeterminate, Earth origin. I would describe it differently, but I'll get to that. The alarm went off at 11:42 station time. Not the general alarm, the Apex Containment Wing alarm, which is a lower tone, a slower pulse, and in 6 years, I had heard it exactly once before, during a drill. The difference between a drill and an actual Apex containment breach is that during a drill, the corridor outside intake fills with orderly Vethrani security personnel moving at a brisk walk. During an actual breach, the corridor fills with orderly Vethrani security personnel moving at something close to a controlled sprint, and their crests are fully raised. I heard the seal on the outer corridor door engage. Lockdown protocol, all non-essential compartments sealed until the wing was recaptured. I was not essential in any tactical sense. I was a human intake officer, sitting at a desk, with a travel carrier under it. I looked at the carrier. Pip's mask face was visible through the mesh, watching the door with the focused, interested expression she used for things that made interesting sounds. "Easy," I said. She looked at me, then back at the door. The warhound came through the ventilation bypass 11 minutes later. I know it was 11 minutes because I was watching the time, the way you do when the corridor outside has gone very quiet and you are in a sealed room with a gap under the equipment rack that you have only just noticed. The Vethrani called them Kelvar. The station kept 4. They were used for high-risk containment scenarios. A Kelvar would track, corner, and hold any target in a pressurized station environment, and they had a 0 escape record in 108 operational deployments. This particular one, designation KV-7, had been in service for 4 years and had neutralized 11 handlers during that time, which was why it was now classified as an Apex tier asset rather than a handler-bonded asset. No handler had successfully bonded with it. It had a separate containment wing and a protocol that required 3 specialists present before the door was opened. One of those specialists had apparently forgotten a step. The Kelvar was large, not large the way a horse is large the way a structure is large, the way something that has been built over a very long time to fill a specific functional purpose is large. Dark plating, bioluminescent tracery along the jawline, 6 limbs, the front pair folded, and the middle pair carrying most of its weight. It came through the gap in the ventilation housing, with a sound like something settling, 400 kilograms of Apex containment animal dropping 3 feet to the deck without apparent effort. And then it was just standing there in my intake bay. It looked at me. I looked at it. I was aware, in a distant and academic way, that I should probably be more frightened than I was, but I had been sitting very still for 11 minutes. which is long enough for the adrenaline to metabolize into something more like steadiness. And what I mostly felt was the particular clarity that comes from having absolutely nothing useful to do. I could not run. The door was locked. I could not fight. I was a customs intake officer. There was nothing between me and a 400-kilogram Apex containment animal, except 6 feet of deck plating and a folding chair, and we both knew it. What happened next is the part all 17 logs struggle with. The latch on Pip's carrier had a tolerance issue I had been meaning to have looked at. The carrier was regulation approved, but the latch pin required a full half-turn to seat properly, and I had been half-turning it for 4 years, without an incident, because nothing in the intake bay had ever vibrated it loose. The emergency door seal, it turned out, produced a resonance frequency that was exactly the wrong frequency for a half-seated latch pin. The carrier door swung open. I did not move. The Kelfar did not move. We both looked at the carrier. Pip came out. She did not come out the way a frightened animal comes out of a carrier. She did not come out the way a cautious animal comes out of a carrier. She came out the way Pip always came out of the carrier when she had decided it was time. Directly, with purpose, at her own pace, as though the rest of the room was an administrative detail she was aware of, but had not yet chosen to address. She hit the deck, shook herself once, and then she did what Pip did every time she was out of the carrier in the intake bay. She investigated. The carrier was under the left side of the desk, the equipment rack was against the right wall, and it had a lower shelf at about deck level, with a gap behind it, where the cable management ran. Pip had investigated this gap on 17 previous occasions. She crossed the deck toward it, 4 feet of pale cream ferret, moving in that particular ferret way that is not quite a walk and not quite a lope, with the low-slung rolling gait that makes them look like a liquid that has decided to have opinions. She passed directly in front of the Kelvar. 11 handlers, 108 operational deployments, 0 escapes. The Kelvar's bioluminescent jaw tracery went dark. Pip did not acknowledge this. She reached the equipment rack, investigated the left corner, decided the left corner was not the corner she wanted, moved to the right corner, found the gap behind the cable management, and went in. The Kelvar sat down. Not backed away, not repositioned. Sat down, the way a very large animal sits when it has made a decision, and the decision is, here. The middle limbs folded under its mass. The front limbs settled. Its head dropped to something close to deck level, and the bioluminescent tracery stayed dark, and it held that position. I waited. The Kelvar waited. From behind the cable management in the equipment rack there was a small, comfortable shifting sound, and then silence. I had time, in the following minutes, to observe the Kelvar at a distance that no one outside the Apex wing was supposed to be at. It was not looking at me anymore. Its head was angled toward the equipment rack, slightly, not pointing at it, not fixated on it, just oriented in that direction, the way a large animal orients toward a thing it has already assessed and categorized. Its tracery stayed dark. Once, around the 12-minute mark, something moved in the corridor outside, and the Kelvar's ear structures shifted, and then went flat again immediately. It did not stand up. I thought about what 11 handlers meant. I thought about 108 operational deployments. I thought about the half-turn on the latch pin, and the resonance frequency of a station emergency seal, and the specific, rolling, unhurried way that Pip had crossed the deck, and I tried to build a theory. I didn't come up with one that satisfied me. What I eventually landed on was simpler. Pip was 5 years old and had spent 4 of those years in an intake bay on a Vethrani orbital station, and in those 4 years, she had been within 3 feet of more alien species than most xenobiologists encounter in a career, and not one of those species had turned out to be interesting to her. She had no framework for threat. She had no reason to have one. She was a ferret on a station, and the station had a rack with a good gap behind the cable management, and that was the relevant information. The Kelvar, it occurred to me, had probably never encountered an animal that simply didn't know what it was. I reached for my comms panel and opened the emergency channel. "Intake Bay 7, I said. KV-7 is in the room with me. It's sitting down. I'd recommend you take your time." There was a pause on the other end that I found understandable. Repeat, intake 7. KV7 is seated. It's been seated for approximately 90 seconds. I would suggest you approach from the corridor door rather than the ventilation housing, and I would suggest you not make any sudden sounds. I paused. There's also a ferret in the room. Don't do anything about that. The second pause was longer. A. What did you say was in the room? A ferret. She's behind the cable management. She's fine. Leave her. They came in 12 minutes later. 3 Apex Wing specialists in full contact-rated gear, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of people who have trained for exactly this, and are hoping very hard that the training is enough. The door opened. The Kelvar's tracery flickered once, and then went dark again. Its head stayed down. The specialists exchanged a look that I could read even through their visors. The lead specialist, a Vethrani named Orveth Suin, I knew him from paperwork. He'd co-signed the welfare clause renewal, stopped 2 meters from the Kelvar, and studied it for a moment. It hasn't moved, he said. Not since it sat down. How long ago was that? 41 minutes. Another look between the specialists. Suan crouched, bringing himself to the Kelvar's eye level, which I thought was either very professional or very brave, and possibly both. The Kelvar looked at him. Its tracery stayed dark. Suan looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the equipment rack. What's behind the cable management? My ferret, I said. She's asleep. Suan turned back to the Kelvar. He said something in Vethrani that I didn't catch. The Kelvar's ear structures, flat to its skull since it sat down, moved once, fractionally, in what the specialists later told me was a voluntary compliance indicator they had only ever achieved in simulation. Suan stood up slowly and looked at the other 2 specialists and made a hand gesture I didn't know, but which produced in both of them the expression of people who have just revised something they thought they understood. They got the containment collar on without incident. KV7 walked back to the Apex Wing under its own direction, which had never happened before in 4 years of service. The specialists followed at 3 meters. Before Suan left the intake bay, he stopped. Has your ferret been in the presence of a Kelvar before? No, I said. Has she been trained in any capacity related to Apex animal interaction? She's trained to use the corner of the carrier as a bathroom, I said. That's the extent of it. Susun looked at the equipment rack for a moment. Then he looked at the carrier under the desk. Then he looked at me. I'll need to file a supplemental form, he said. I have forms, I said. I'm an intake officer. The supplemental form took 3 weeks to process. The Apex Behavior Registry entry, stimulus animal, class indeterminate, Earth origin, voluntary arrest event, Vethrani Station 12, 14.9 standard, was the first new entry in the unassisted compliance category in the registry's 40-year operational history. Pip got a second carrier. Regulation approved, with a latch that required a full turn. She investigated the new latch for about 30 seconds, and then decided it was not interesting. She went to sleep in the back corner, which she had already determined was the correct corner, and that was that. I went back to my manifests. The next freighter was due in 4 hours. The coffee, as usual, was not good. Outside the intake bay, Vethrani Station 12 ran its normal operations, the same as any other day, the same as every day for 6 years. Nothing happens fast in intake. That's the part they always leave out of the logs.